So in some cases, a search box isn't really the right solution. Maybe cocktails is a good example of that. I might not know all the names of the cocktails, but I might just want some mechanism to explore all of them without getting too overwhelmed, right? So what if I do it one letter at a time? It allows me to kind of browse around the cocktails without being too overwhelmed, right? Maybe there's 1,000 cocktails, and that's too much. But if I take 1,000 divided by 26 letters, I've broken down the problem into bite-sized chunks. And this is something maybe that our users would appreciate, not being overwhelmed by information and yet having some window into it. All right, so cocktails A to Z is solving for a different use case than the search box. And, what use case are you solving for? What do your users expect? And on the other side, what does your API allow or enable? And there's a sweet spot in the middle where you can optimize for both of those things or leverage the available tools to achieve something that your users will be happy with. So to put this a little more concretely, these cocktails are coming from here. The CocktailDB is an API that's free and public. It turns out that we can search all cocktails by first letter. And so this is in fact where I got the idea for an A to Z index. I thought, hey, this is a feature of the API. Why not leverage this feature to give users a kind of breakdown of all the cocktails that's a little more user-friendly than seeing everything at once? Okay, so it also happens to have a search endpoint as well. So we could just as well apply the search box from before. That IMDb search box could work equally well for cocktails, right? So there are different technical possibilities that the API would suggest to us, and they would correspond, each of them, to a different UI, perhaps, or a different user experience. In this case, I am using the first letter endpoint, and notice they use search, and then F for first letter equals A means first letter A. And this is the pattern from their documentation that I'm also following in my JavaScript, only in a more interactive way, in a more dynamic way. So rather than hard coding this F equals A, I'm instead building that menu so that this endpoint and the query parameters can be produced on the fly, depending on what the user clicked. So each of these letters has some ID attached to it, and that ID can then be used within my fetch URL. Let's take an example. I'm on the letter N here, so if I inspect that, this menu item is different from the others. First of all, it says selected, right? And that has style implications. The background is different from the others. So we'll look at that too. But notice also it has ID equals N. And that's a little bit of data that I can then extract from the menu item and send along to my fetch request in JavaScript. So let's see how that works now in practice. Here at the top, I have an array of letters, and there would be other ways to do this dynamically, but here you can see also in a transparent way what's happening. I've literally put the alphabet into an array for us. So that's a pretty simple concept. But now we can take each letter, let's say alphabet dot for each letter. That's a really nice, concise way of describing an iterative loop, iterating through all the elements in this kind of alphabet array, right? So we're going to take each letter one at a time, A, B, C, and for each letter we're going to do something. Well, what are we going to do with each letter? My goal was to build a little navigation. So for each letter, I'm creating an element, and it's an A tag, a link, if you will. And I'm also adding to that A tag the content. The letter goes inside of it, and it also goes on the ID of that item. So this construction of an A tag in JavaScript, it mirrors what we just saw in the inspector here. When I pointed us to the letter N, this A tag indeed has an ID and it has N inside of it. So JavaScript was able to build this menu item. And now it's activating that menu item as well. So when I click on it, I want something to happen. So I've added here an event listener, not for a form submission, but for a click. So when I click on any of these A tags, what's going to happen? Well, I don't specify that here, but further down. I made a function just to handle those clicks. And that way here, I can just handle building the nav, and elsewhere I can handle the behavior. So there's a function called clickLetter waiting to receive this event from the click event listener. Okay, so that event, that menu item, when it gets clicked on, triggers an event. That event is passed along to our clickLetter function, and it will take it from here, let's say. So clickLetter that we are calling here is in fact defined a few lines later down. Here it is. This function runs whenever a letter is clicked on. So in this pattern, whatever it is you're clicking on, you want something to happen, you would put inside of this function. And what should happen when I click on a letter? Well, notice I'm changing the CSS. I'm saying remove selected from all the items and then add selected to this particular item. Okay, so whatever item was selected before is no longer selected. But the one that I just clicked on, it's now selected, so it's going to turn red. Yeah? So we saw that if I click on a different letter, it turns red. And it gains the selected class. Whereas all the other ones, they lose the selected class. They're no longer selected. Okay, so we have a bit of CSS classes being swapped around here. So remove selected from all the elements, query selector all, menu item, and then add it back into the one we just clicked on, the current letter, if you will. What else are we going to do with the current letter? Well, we're going to go fetch some drinks, right? And so get drinks current letter is kind of linked to the next step in this chain of functions. And sure enough, it's defined here. Get drinks, modular code defines each function with one purpose only. Keeps your code nice and clean, so you're only doing one thing at a time. And the one thing we're doing now is getting drinks. And what do we have? We have a letter. Well, it's time to build a URL, and just like before, we're making a new URL here and adding to it one search parameter, f, and we've seen that before in the documentation, right? The documentation showed us this f equals a as an example, and I'm now expanding this to f equals whatever I clicked on. Okay, so you see that model is being followed here. By setting the parameter f to match whatever the current letter is, we can make a request for any cocktail beginning with any letter. And so we end up again with a fetch, a dynamically generated URL that's been contextualized within this user interface. And just like before with IMDb movies, there's a separate function for displaying the results. So again, there's one function for fetching and then another one for displaying. So if we ended up on the display drinks function, everything else has already happened. The fetching is done, the clicking is done, the menu item has already been selected. By the time we get here, all we have is data and we're ready to display it. And so this should start to look familiar. We have, again, some kind of template that we build. And we populate that, in this case, with a thumbnail image and the name of the drink. How do I know that these variables exist? Right? Well, the API, if we're curious about what it gives us, we can, of course, log those to the console. And this is what I've done here. So for each of the drinks, we will have data in the console that we can inspect. And that will tell us exactly what is available to us. And indeed, there's a variable called string drink. And that's the one I'm referring to in my template, string drink. Right? There's a lot of other stuff too that I didn't use. And so here's where your creativity comes in. Given this data set, what else can I do besides, a simple list of drinks? After all, these drinks have a lot of interesting properties. Some of them are alcoholic, some not. Some of them are shots and some not. Some of them have many ingredients. Some of them have few ingredients. So given a data set, we should be able to envision a variety of templates that could emerge from the same data set. Nobody's forcing you to use this model. You could do almost anything you like given that variety of data that's here. Yeah. That takes us to the end where each item is appended to the page. And you'll notice, of course, that if I click on a new item, what happens? We reset the main content to remove the previous results. So if I click on a new letter, those results go away. Watch what happens if I comment this out for a minute. If we don't clear away the previous drinks, but instead keep them there, if now I add C and D, I now have C and D together on the same page because I forgot to clear the C elements away. So you see how that line is important here. I reset the contents of that main area to be blank initially, and then I repopulate it with the new content based on whatever letter was clicked.